thank you so much for coming to join us, because I think your career and all of the companies you work with, the impact that you have, I think our audience will find it very inspirational of what they can also achieve over the next few decades. So thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me. Cool. Hi everyone, good to see you today. I'm going to try and do a sort of side-to-side manoeuvre to get as much eye contact with all of you. So I suppose a couple of bits of context. Geographically, it's really lovely to be able to come and give a talk at one of the Cambridge colleges, because I actually grew up in St Ives, so half an hour down the road. So that's just a really nice thing I wanted to mention. And I went to secondary school at Impington, which is within Cambridge. I had thought everyone here was, I know you're doing different subjects of masters, but I thought we're more Cambridge based, but I've learned that you're from all over the country. So it's great we can all come together in Cambridge today. This course sounds phenomenal. Just been learning more and more about the course and what you're all up to. And it's something that certainly when I was starting out would have been amazing to help support me and many others. So I think, why we're all here together is really good. And in terms of my story, so I guess as always, there's some different threads to pull upon. Disability-wise, I was born with spinal muscular atrophy, so I was about 18 months when I was diagnosed, and I had my first power wheelchair at the age of 3. So I'm always keen to sort of share that my lived experience is that of being in a wheelchair all my waking hours, and I've never been able to walk. I've always needed a lot of support physically with everyday living, from obviously parents back in the day, and more recently with personal care assistants such as Aga, who's phenomenal, supporting with all my endeavours lately as well. And I suppose like growing up, I imagine lots of us are aware of the social model barriers. I think that's an interesting evolution for me, when I had not heard anything about disability rights and disability inclusion until I actually got my first job. So I was at school, then I went to uni, and just living my life and not thinking about that macro part of inclusion. And it was only when I got my first job at the charity called Scope that, how many of you are aware of Scope? A few nods, yeah. One of the big disability charities. And for me, having done economics degree and then a master's in marketing, this was at Coventry Uni, which was very much Coventry because they were geared up for the care, support and accessibility. So certainly back then it was going to uni was a big deal for me, and I think quite a lot of disabled people faced a lot of barriers. I think there still are barriers today around going to uni, and let alone all parts of everyday life. But certainly over 20 years ago, when I went to uni, it was a lot to just figure out the disability part. So Coventry won because it was really geared up. So having done the studies there, had a good, very, very good time while I was at Coventry, as well as studying as well. Lots of partying, lots of how to live life as an independent person, having care assistants and not relying on mum and dad to have to put me to bed if I came home drunk late from a night out or whatever. So sort of skipping around a bit of that backstory, but ultimately Scope was where I had that first contact with the social model. And I think for me, the notion that I'm not the problem, inverted commas, from a societal perspective. Of course, I have spinal muscular atrophy. Of course, I have my care needs. Of course, I have to make sure I look after myself, particularly with chest infections. Like, the medical side is real, but to see that the way society is designed, the way streets and buildings and all of that are designed, they don't have to be inaccessible. And that was a real unlock, that people design systems. So if we can connect with those that do the designing, or even become part of the people that have the responsibility, then there's a lot of positives can come from that. And also attitudinally, like we all know, unfortunately even today there are the prejudice, discrimination around disability. And indeed we know other minority groups, the sort of DEI more broadly, there's still too much of that going on. But again, attitudes are a barrier. It's a social construct that with education that can be changed. And I think chats back in the day at Scope, let alone decade or two on, there are limitations to the social model as well. And I don't want to get so lost in pure academia of disability inclusion, but I think we all understand frameworks help. Even when I did economics, it was like one of the teachers taught us that, you know, a lot of the models, they're maps to help us understand the real world. But when we look at a map on our phone or a paperback, it doesn't look like the actual road that you're driving along. So they're just guides, and we can accept there are those limitations as well. So anyway, that was a real grounding for me, quite liberating, the social model. And then pressing on from that, Scope was a way of learning to, if I could manage working full time in an office, how that would go. So just figuring a lot out for myself, to put it more simply. And then through the time at Scope, I just felt, maybe as Martin, not as a disabled person, but just as Martin, I didn't want to always be in an office. I was quite entrepreneurial, and as lovely as Scope was nurturing me in my career and personal development, it just started to feel like there were other things I wanted to pursue. So I started blogging. So again, aging myself, but 2009, blogging wasn't, and content wasn't a big thing. And I had a mentor that explained how to start a website with a blog, how to write articles, how to make videos. And I wanted to do that, the lived experience I had as a disabled guy then in my 20s. But I also knew that there was a purpose behind it. It wasn't just to share me working or going out to a football match or whatever, or dating back then as well. But you know, it was to educate society about maybe a different narrative of disability than was often in the media. And also, I think, for the next generation of disabled people to see that going to uni is possible, that working is possible, that traveling is possible. So yeah, around that time I started creating content. That led to running a magazine called Disability Horizons, which ran for about 12 years, and again was quite pioneering back in 2011. And then when I wrapped it up, it felt it had had its purpose of being a place for disabled people to share their stories and publish content, whereas like the world moved on and everyone had their own Instagram and their own TikTok, so there wasn't the same need for that. We also, the magazine was difficult funding it, but we, and, you know, bear in mind I'm still trying to earn a living through all of this. As much as there's the purpose, the mission, I still had rent or then later mortgage and, you know, food on the table. So we spun out of the magazine an accessible accommodation website called Accomable. So we got startup funding, angel investment, and ultimately Airbnb acquired Accomable. Unfortunately, it wasn't like putting me in a large castle in the countryside level of acquisition, but it was great that a mainstream brand understood that there's a business case to disability inclusion. I think you can then start to see personal advocacy, personal storytelling, empowering community, the business case of inclusion, let alone the benefits of politics around inclusion, and then using media and technology. That's sort of where everything eventually came together, where I can look back and go, oh, look how neat that now is. But through 10 or 15 years, it was proper fake it till you make it and just like trying to figure it all out. So in 2020, I started Purple Goat, which is basically an influencer marketing agency specializing around disabled content creators, the Instagrammers and TikToks that I spoke to, but also, and that's where I shifted gear from sharing my story and then empowering community to needing to get in the rooms where marketing people with marketing budget would want to spend that around disability. And that's been a whole chapter of how do you get in the rooms of the gatekeepers within business. And I think that's also the last year or two started to happen a bit politically. That we spoke a little bit earlier about, they did a round table around disabled content creators and government looking at that. So that there's a newer, almost maybe a newer chapter emerging a bit around that same approach to politics, but obviously applied to media, applied to business. And so with Purple Goat, it was me. I was the marketing and sales team in 2020. Now we're about 20 people and working with the big global brands. I started it with another influencer agency and they sold their agency to WPP. Don't want to get too lost in like marketing world only, because I know people here have different masters and different disciplines, but for those that know marketing, WPP are a massive behemoth of a marketing agency. So by proxy, they took on the minority stake of Purple Goat. So I've also been navigating how to work through a global marketing agency, not only selling direct to brands. I know we said earlier, like, there'll be questions and I'm happy to answer more specific things, and I'm trying to give like a 20-year summary of different stuff that's gone on. But I think to your point earlier, Jenny, was like some of the case studies was Tesco was the first big brand that we worked with. And in that instance, they had budget because I think it was the 100th store with a change in places toilet. And so we activated 5 disabled Instagrammers to go to the local Tesco store that had a change in place toilet and obviously show how important that was to disabled people. So that was a very disability specific thing. But then we've done all sorts of activations with banks and travel brands. Like you name the industry, we probably work with a brand, and they're not always focusing on disability. It's disabled people like in fashion or going on holiday, but it doesn't have to be sort of so disability only. It's representation, it's real life, it's just storytelling. And I think that's been quite important for me, that I actually didn't think I would want to work in disability, but then you realise how so much of the world needs to be sorted out. You kind of feel compelled to get stuck in and sort it out in your own little personal way. But I always caveat, I don't think every disabled leader has to try to like only focus on the disability side. Having disabled teachers and disabled lawyers and disabled business people, disabled politicians, like not only speaking with the community is also really progressive and really important. But obviously, when we can bring community into those rooms that I said, that's for me, it's a privilege to be able to have done the things we've been up to in our little corner of the whole bigger puzzle. I don't know how long I've been talking, if that was 15 or 20 or more or less, but that feels like a kind of nice point up to where I've got to. There's still a lot more to do at Purple Goat, more brands to work with, more content creators to work with. But as I said, I'm also at this chapter of business is an easier way to actually get in the room with the gatekeepers, and it's quite a fast pace in business. Politics is a bit of another beast, but I think we'd all admit the last 5-10 years has been a bit regression in the cultural, social, politics side of disability. So let's not lose the progress in business, but it feels like there's a bit of work, understatement, to get sorted on the politics world. And that's something I'm quite excited through something called the Purple Collective, which is looking at systems change and models of change and how we do kind of the same thing we did at Purple Goat, but in those like political kind of citizen conversations as well. So yeah, just thanks again for having me today. I'm sure we'll all get to talk a bit more through the evening, and best of luck with your course, and I hope you get a lot out of the course as well. Thank you. I grew up near St Ives, and the local secondary was the Ivo in St Ives. That was not accessible for a wheelchair user. Mum and Dad tried to kind of fight for funding to build lifts or ramps, but it was too much money and too late to do the changes when I was going to go. So it was either the Ernolf in a place called St Neots or Impington in Cambridge, because they were very geared up. So it was quite spread out, but it was all wheelchair accessible. And then they had a building called the Pavilion, which is where the physios, and back then they were called LSAs, the Learning Support Assistants. So I had the support with my disability from the Pavilion and from the LSAs, but I then went to all the classes with my non-disabled classmates and was within the mainstream curriculum and did that all the way to A level. And it's kind of what I spoke about at Coventry. They were such the fundamental important part that I could get everywhere and have the support. And then the other stuff was like the bonus in a weird way, like at that time. Like, would I have gone to Coventry Uni if it wasn't for that? I don't know. But it certainly was a big factor of why I, with my access needs, did. But yeah, I was there, what would it have been, 7 years at Impington, and yeah, I had a great time. It was good school. Ultimately, like life is nuanced, isn't it? So I think we need advocates, and it's important there are advocates. And if someone feels that's their path, they shouldn't not do it because it seems too cliche. But I also don't think being an advocate means we can't do other things as well, or that there can't be a balance to it. So yeah, it feels like I'm kind of giving a on the fence answer, but I actually just think it comes back to we all self-reflect what we care about in the world, what we think our strengths are, what our weaknesses are, opportunities that come our way that seem, you want to just grab them because why not? And maybe sometimes we can overthink what the label is or what that label means, when actually, if you're enjoying it and you're doing good stuff, that is enough as well. And you can later in career meander and change and do other things as well. But I do think there's a benefit of not only churning out advocates, that, like I said, we need people that understand law to be able to be an advocate within a legal context. So it's almost like to translate different worlds within society, like the business world has a language, the legal world has a language, the media world has a language. So it's not that everyone's just a vanilla advocate. It's being able to bridge and to translate is a really important and sometimes difficult skill set. So I wouldn't feel that any of us should think it's diminished by being an advocate. It's almost like a tool amongst other tools to get the job done, to make the change we want to change. I think true authenticity is the point of what you're speaking about. I even come back to the previous question. It's that when you're in that role as well, it's being your authentic self as an advocate is a point that felt like it was coming through, but specifically to traditional and new media or social media, like, we actually know the data. So when I started Purple Goat, it was with this other agency called the Goat Agency, and they pioneered how to do influencer marketing with brands as a model, and it's very, very data driven. Like, of course, when you look at Purple Goat, everyone knows we work with Instagrammers and TikTokers and sometimes LinkedIn when it's B2B, but it's only valuable to a brand when there are high impressions and high engagement and positive sentiment in the comments. And the only way you get that is by being real and authentic. Anyone that isn't, we all smell it a mile off. And even if they sort of blag their way for a while, they can't keep the mask on for long. And in the end, the data actually shows. So it's actually quite measurable that authenticity always wins. but we get told other stories in maybe traditional media that undermines the positive. We were saying at the dinner, weren't we, about, you know, there's sometimes a bad rep for content creators and influencers, and some are just trying to make a quick buck, but again, they get found out, like the authenticity comes through in the end. So does that answer the question? Yeah. Cool, thank you. The first thing is, I don't say worry, because worry is maybe a bit too stressful, like don't worry, but like be very aware that we all need money to live, so that shouldn't be awkward or icky, that should just be a fact. A very personal anecdote, I was on a reasonable paid job as a salary at Scope, and when I left I had part rent, part mortgage in London, because I couldn't find accessible accommodation in London. I wouldn't have got a mortgage, but the only place I could find was part rent, part buy. So at baseline I had rent/mortgage to pay. And in the build, when I handed my notice in, I'd started to win a couple of little freelance contracts. I was okay for 3-4 months, but I had to keep sustaining that. And there was a point where I also wanted to travel. So I got funding from the European Union to do a voluntary project, inverted commas, where you go abroad. It's called EVS, European Voluntary Service. So I spent a few months living in the north of Spain, which was amazing. I got to travel, learn another language. I was still running the kind of magazine and the freelance stuff online, but I Airbnb'd my flat out, so I didn't have to worry about covering the cost. So in the end, it's like you've got your income and you've got your expenses. And if there's a point where the income is not quite where you want it to be, then you get creative. And so I spent a year or two where I was then bouncing around traveling, but I lived back a bit with my mum for a month here and a month there in my late 20s. So, you know, there's all that sort of, wow, Purple Goat's cool, but like they were the risks I took a long time ago for that to be possible. And I would still say the word risk, it was managed. It wasn't like bet on the casino and then lose everything. It was always very thoughtful risk, but obviously leaving a salary job was a risk. And then from that point, everyone's going to have a different journey of how you have a salary or funding. And we were talking earlier over the dinner that when a lot of us care about systems change, that's hard to sell as a product or a service. And then when you know there's a product or service, there can be systems change. I wanted to say that to you about your book. You would say, like, there definitely can be both, but you can then easily get lost in the product and the marketing and the financial and lose sight of why you started it. And so I think there's always a tension between the money and the purpose, and both have to be satisfied. It's back to my earlier on the fence. It's a bit on the fence, but it is a balance, and it's true. Yeah. Okay. When I was in employment, I found it hard going to the office 5 days a week, 9 to 5, particularly in the winter months. And that was way before pandemic work at home became a little bit more allowable. And we know even now employers are starting to push back to get people back in the office. And again, there is reasons why that's good, but I'm just saying that even at a disability charity, it wasn't the done thing that you worked from home, because you felt like everyone would think you're just lying in and, you know, you're lazy. So I think there's an employment point, just to make that point about managing condition, particularly what I experienced. When I was in the magazine and the travel company and freelance, it felt quite easy to run the hours that I could run, and if I needed a day off, it was okay. When Purple Goat grew after a year, 2 years, we went over £1 million revenue mark. We had to bring on more people in the team. Any entrepreneur will tell you that they can't let go because they worry no one's going to do it the way they do it. And I was forced to actually delegate because I burnt out, like, really very heavily, like mental health. I was having like panic attacks on video calls, and it was quite bad. And I'd never had panic attacks. I've never had mental health challenges. So at first I was like, oh my God, I've got some horrible physical thing and I'm going to die. It was that severe. And then I understood it was mental health, but it was very viscerally physical at the same time. So I had to have a bit of time out. Others stepped in, the world didn't end, and it showed me that you have to delegate and trust others, even if that's difficult. But it wasn't like the perfect roadmap of delegation. It was, my body literally was like, we're not doing this anymore. And so all the other things I used to do without flinching, like public speaking, I couldn't do it for a year or two, because I was like, what if I feel dizzy and I'm gonna like not feel well? And so that was quite a difficult journey, but I learned about mental health and how to look after myself. And also, like, I don't sort of keep talking about me being older. My age is 42, and people sometimes talk about, my wife calls it midlife awakening rather than midlife crisis, but quite often around late 30s, early 40s, a lot of people will say that there's some stuff goes on that makes you reckon with stuff you didn't try to deal with. So without going into like a psychology lecture, I definitely did a lot of work the last 3-4 years on myself, and that's been quite an interesting journey as well. Yeah, which I'm very happy to chat about, but something I hadn't thought to mention earlier, so that's why I loved your question.
What is the thing that you're most proud of, and why?
I think it goes without saying, Purple Goat, I'm very proud of working with the brands and the team we've built, and there's still, I mean, there's economic challenges that we're still an SME at the end of the day, a small medium enterprise, so there's still a lot to figure out and do as well with Purple Goat. But put a pin in that, probably the travels. I've written a book called Everything is Possible, which even then I like. So I think Chris and I could chat for hours about language and semantics. Like, I definitely, when I wrote it 10 years ago, there was that youthful, everything's possible and you put your mind to it. And then now getting that there's nuances and counterpoints to that as well. So I might do a sequel that does all the caveats. But nonetheless, I've been to a lot of the world, both as travel trips, like blogging about destinations, but also speaking at conferences, meeting other disabled people and organisations. I did a road trip around Europe. John goes to Land's End in a wheelchair, and my wife was on a bicycle. Yeah, like all sorts of adventure, like flown a plane, scuba dived. So, like teenage me was like, what am I going to be able to do with these limitations in a world that's not built? And it was satisfying. I don't want to be too provocative, but a bit like putting a middle finger up to parts of the world. But yeah, now I'm sort of, I don't want to do more of that. I'm in a different place where it's not about the next adrenaline hit. It's a bit more about systems change and mentoring and advising other people as well. So that's like a future chapter. But yeah, I think that the travels in the book is a big one. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes. Where's the place you've been?
Barcelona always comes to top of mind.
Yeah.
It's very wheelchair accessible, which is like a bit the Impington Coventry point. But also, like, even, like I say, as Martin, not just as wheelchair user Martin, I love Spain, I love, well, it's Catalan, so it's a bit of a different language to Spanish, but yeah, I love Barcelona, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I've been very inspired by our amazing scholars over the last day and a half, and I just wondered what advice you can offer them to take forward, because you've got all this incredible experience yourself.
Yeah, thank you. I was thinking before, like, what's the three kind of points of...
I thought you might be unhappy if I
three things are always good, but that is, in a way, it's implicit of the whole conversation. I think certainly what we're speaking about around that tension around disability advocacy and then being a part of a career in a vertical, not only as a disabled person. So I think in the end it's that self-awareness of like what excites us, what also pisses us off that we want to fix, what kind of people we want to hang out with and build team. A team doesn't have to be build a startup. Like that's been an expression of my work, but it doesn't have to be startup, scale up, entrepreneur. But like working with good people is enjoyable, and so there's some sentiments about enjoying life and those sort of things. But yeah, and I think we touched on the mental health. I think if something is for a prolonged period not resonating anymore, change is good and change is fine as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. Final question at the end.
That one probably is a better one to end on.
No, go for it.
No more crude questions.
I'm just curious how it works when you work with the brands. Are they approaching you?
It would be nicer if they did.
Yeah, and are they like receptive to working with disabled influencers, and kind of how does that process work?
Honestly, it's hard. That a little bit of chat over dinner about it as well. That I think you asked me, didn't you, which brands have been more receptive? And Lloyds Bank were great because they sponsored the lineup review when I was on the steering group, and so when I met them, they were already spending money on the topic around disabled entrepreneurship and understood the economic side and the business case already. It didn't mean they were like, hey Martin, can we give budget to you? It took like, I happened to meet the CEO, which again about being in rooms, like that, it's so much about network as well. But from lucky enough to have met the CEO, there were 4 or 5 more meetings before actual budget was then coming to Purple Go. And I think any marketing agency does a lot of free work in terms of pitching, but we're educating a lot about disability in the business case, and no brand has a media spend budget item of disability. And I'd say less and less DEI the last 2 or 3 years, unfortunately. So we still have a business proposition, but they're then having to find the budget from other pots of marketing money. Ideally, it would be social media or influencer budget, but they're still seeing it very disability, and that's what we're trying to change. I think it's marketing to a group of consumers, but they get a bit het up about what if it goes wrong, or what if we say something that is going to offend people. So there's a lot of reassurance and overcoming fear as well. So it's a process.